Oh, and
Hi, Dan. We can't hear you. Are we on?
I know.
Yes. Hello. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to our final session for today, a roundtable discussion about non-fungible tokens or NFTs. I'm really pleased to welcome three very important speakers on the topic, and I'm just going to have a very short introduction for each one of them. We'll have a little bit of an intro to the topic from each speaker, and then we'll open it up to roundtable discussion, and we'll welcome all your comments. So our first speaker for today is Nick Dunmer. Nick has been working as a photographer in advertising and commercial sectors for all his career. He's also the business and legal advisor for the Association of Photographers, a trained association that exists to protect, promote, and inspire professionals at all levels. Nick's experience as a photographer couples with his legal training and puts him in this unique position in terms of advising and supporting others. Welcome, Nick, and thank you for coming today.
Thanks, Antigone. Nice to be here.
Our second speaker for today is Rhiannon Adam. Rhiannon is a London-based photographer who specializes in social documentary projects told through experimental analog processes. Her work focuses on marginalized communities, climate change, and the space between fact and fiction. She is the author of two books, the one by Thames and Hudson called Polaroid: The Missing Manual, and the second one published by Blow Up Press called Big Fence, Pitcairn Island. And I think she's going to talk a little bit about both of them. Rienen became involved in the crypto world in 2016, and in 2021, she became part of Gitcoin's kernel program. She's currently working on an experimental arts funding and mentorship program powered by lottery-style NFT sales with a decentralized management structure. She also does NFTs. Her work creates her work as an NFT, and that work has featured in the British Journal of Photography. And she's currently writing a book about the first decade of the NFTs, which is to be published in 2022. So welcome, Rienen. It's great to see you here.
Thank you for having me.
And the third speaker for today is Gareth Fletcher, who is the program director for the MA in Art Logistics and leader of the Art Crime online intensive course at Sotheby's Institute of Art. He also lectures the application and adoption of blockchain systems within the art market for an online program called Art and Tech, Data, Market Analysis and Blockchain. He's also writing his PhD thesis at the moment on the semiotics of provenance info in the establishment of cultural and economic value in the market for Near Eastern antiquities, and he has received an HRC scholarship for that. And he also researching on the interface between the contextual formation of cultural objects and technology and the integration of traditional art market processes within Web 3.0 applications. So Gareth, thank you, and thank you all for joining us today. So
thank you very much,
Antigone. Nick.
Thank you, Antigone, for that kind welcome. Hi, Gareth. Hi, Rhiannon. I guess we overlap in some interesting ways, I think, in terms of our various roles. But I think as a way to kick this off, because it's a continuous, expanding, developing space. I think that's a really important point to make right from the word go. That what we are about to discuss or about to say may well not be the case in a week, a month, 2 months, a year, or whatever. I think things are changing quite quickly. But we can start with some basics, I think, to make sure that everybody, there's a lot of vocabulary. I'm sure we would all agree that there's a lot of language that's flying around, and having an understanding of what the terms mean and what we're actually talking about might be a good place to start, because I think regardless of how things shift and change over the next months or years or whatever, some of this will stay sort of fairly set in stone. So yeah, what is an NFT? I think that's a good place to start. We know it means non-fungible token, but trying to work out what those three words actually are about is sometimes quite tricky. I like to think of it as a digital receipt for something, for a digital asset, if you like. So that asset could be a JPEG file, and I suppose if we're talking about photography, that's the central premise of why we're here discussing this. Then the JPEG file is the easiest, simplest form in which that might an image might exist, or .mov or an MP4, or it could be any sort of digital asset. And this receipt, this non-fungible token, it exists to establish ownership of that particular digital asset. So the word fungible, non-fungible rather, actually just means it cannot be exchanged for something else. It's not. There's no exact. A common example given is I give you a pound coin, you give me another pound coin. They're completely interchangeable. They mean they're worth exactly the same thing. It doesn't matter who has which one. They are identical. So those are fungible examples of fungible things, if you like, things that can be swapped. So the whole premise of creating an NFT or minting, and that's another bit of vocabulary that crops up. The process of creating is called minting. And what we're talking about might appear at first glance to be slightly odd, because we're talking about creating something that has scarcity ascribed to it. Now, we were chatting before we came on the call, and before we just Rhiannon was talking about her practice, and I'll leave it to you to explain that more, Rhiannon, in terms of the analog to transitioning into digital. But it is quite an interesting point to consider that an NFT, the creation of some scarcity on something which is inherently, completely and infinitely reproducible. You can duplicate a digital asset, a digital file, as many times as you like, and create an exact copy that is as good as the original. That idea of scarcity in the art world has long been the sort of the holy grail, if you like, of creating value, or partly of creating value, and how you monetize the output, how you monetize what you're actually making, whether it's a painting, whether it's writing, whether it's a lithograph, whether it's a photograph, whatever that might be. So this has exploded onto the world of photography in the last 18 months, no, maybe a year, perhaps, something like that. I think NFTs have been around longer than that, as I think Rhiannon and Gareth would confirm. I'll leave the history for another time, but I think it's got a lot of interest amongst photographers in particular, who see this as a way of taking back some form of control over monetizing what they want to make and how they want to get it in front of an audience, and taking maybe the more traditional platform of intermediaries out of that equation, and connecting themselves directly with a group of people who buy and sell what they're interested in. I think, without wanting to go too far down sort of any of the other sort of technical terms, I mean, Gareth, have I missed anything in terms of a baseline introduction to that, given your position and expert knowledge on the subject as well?
Nick, thank you very much, and absolutely no, you've done really well, and your definitions are very clear and comprehensible. So I think we're in a good sort of position here to move forward. Thanks very much. Excellent.
Well, perhaps it would be, instead of me just talking and then moving along, I mean, perhaps if we move into a bit more of a conversation, that would be more interesting for everybody else. I don't know, Rhiannon, when did you first start becoming aware of and then getting involved with?
So as I said, I first kind of became quite heavily interested in crypto in 2016. I actually have a friend that runs a crypto-based company, a savings program, who I went to secondary school with, and we then went to university together. So she was my conduit, I suppose. My guide. And I think sometimes the difficulty with the NFT world right now is that there are not enough people who can act as reliable guides. And so I became interested just in general in the idea of sort of trust networks, I suppose, because photography particularly, we're always concerned about trust and authenticity, and how much is this thing more real than another thing. And because my work is analog in basis, I think a lot of people would think that the NFT world would sit completely at odds with that. But when you're an analog photographer, you are often quite concerned with the idea of creating this sense of the real, the original, the sort of definitive object. And my work, though it's documentary in basis, it generally deals with the idea of, this space between what is fact and what is fiction, which photography has always struggled with. And so I thought there were a lot of interesting parallels with blockchain technology and the kind of the struggles that we will have as photographers of sort of defining these quite woolly concepts of fact and fiction. And so, of course, initially when you start delving into NFTs, you come across like the Nyan cat, or you look at very kind of early artwork, which is pretty much looks a little bit like, I suppose, playing early video games on PCs in the 90s.
Like Crypto Kitties, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And my friend Rachel, who was my conduit, we used to actually play a game called Pets, which was, in the 90s, where you could breed pets and create new pets. And it was pretty much Crypto Kitties. It was just a game. And this idea of creating, scarcity, in a way, it didn't seem that alien to me, because I'd seen all of the crazes through secondary school, primary school, where people would have things like pogs, or they would swap telephone cards or panini stickers or whatever it was. It was just another form of collecting things. And I'm such a collector of things that this NFT space, it seemed to be like a perfect fit. And what I'd always loved about, the work that I create with Polaroid was very much that the Polaroid could only ever exist in one place at one time. And then the irony was that for much of my time, I spent, I've got a scanner sitting right next to me, as I can see you've got one behind you. And I spent all my time making this thing that was a physical, real object reproducible. And in order for people to see the thing, I was having to scan the thing and put it onto the internet to make friends that also believed in the authenticity of the thing. And there was some sort of deep-rooted irony in the sense of community that I built around my work, which was all about reproducing this thing, which was inherently, like, the whole point of it was that you couldn't reproduce it. Yeah. So, the whole kind of basis of my career is built on this kind of false, shaky ground where I've had to digitize a physical thing. So the NFT, it felt a quite natural conclusion to that process. In a sense, it was restoring this idea of authenticity and realness and scarcity onto the thing that I had created as something infinitely reproducible.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you're coming at this from the position of a photographer making analog or making work in an analog way, and then looking for a mechanism by which you can translate that into something that's still scarce but digital.
Yeah, I mean, there's always this suspicion about, well, you can just download a JPEG and you can share it a million times. Well, yes, you can. And every time, and quite often, I'll have an exhibition somewhere. Say I'm not visiting Berlin, and someone from Berlin says, "I'd like to put your work in a show." I then send them a TIFF file. Is that TIFF file the original, or is it the instructions that go with the TIFF file? And the longevity of the usage that I'm granting them, or the intent that I'm attaching to this file, is that what makes the object? Is it suddenly not my work because someone else printed it? There are so many questions that we sort of face all the time. when people are so obsessed with the idea of, I don't know, that the photograph needs to be the physical print made by the photographer. Well, what happens with an archive where the photographs are printed after a photographer has long since passed away? You know, is that an original because it came from the negative? Is it more of an original because it came from the first run of the 10 prints that the photographer created? You know, what I like about the NFT is that it gives back some of that sense of, you know, this reproducibility is given back to the photographer to decide the terms and the parameters of how reproducible they want that thing to be, or what is their inherent intent with the creation of the work.
Yeah, I think when you explain it in those terms, it does make much more sense. I think, you know, as many people will know, I mean, this gets talked about on social media a lot, on Twitter. I mean, there's a huge amount of sort of information brackets misinformation on those kind of platforms where people don't sort of take the time to just read through the topic and find out, you know, what's a good source of information, what's a dodgy source, what's opinion, what's not been sort of backed up by anything else. I mean, I think, and a lot of that discussion is not about photography. It's about the process. It's about the sort of the apparatus and the framework that kind of supports that. And for those, I suppose, for those people that may be unsure about that, you know, an NFT, this digital receipt, it's entered into a ledger that's called a blockchain, and that exists amongst, it's a peer-to-peer network, effectively spread amongst a huge network of different computers, and there are lots of different blockchains, just as there are lots of different cryptocurrencies, you know. And I think some people talk about the blockchain like there is only one, but there are lots and lots of different ones. And I don't know how many cryptocurrencies there are today, so you'll have a better idea of that, Rienen, but there's hundreds, aren't there?
I mean, thousands.
Thousands.
Yeah.
And again, I think people focus on Ethereum as the currency that is associated with NFT sort of production and trade and all the rest of it. But that's no longer true either. And I think that's changed quite quickly, hasn't it, over the past sort of year or so. And again, going back to other snippets of information that people may have read a little bit about or heard a little bit about, things like the environmental aspects of creating NFTs, that is something that we can discuss, I guess, but it's, again, something that's moving very, very fast as far as how big an environmental impact this process actually has when you start looking at different types of blockchain, whether it's proof of work or proof of stake. And again, more jargon, more terminology, which I don't know if somebody else wants to explain some of those. You might know a bit more about it than I do.
I mean, yeah, there are many other different validation mechanisms as well. And I think with Ethereum, it's just that most things were just happened to be built on Ethereum. And, you know, as we had in the chat just before we even opened this up, we are talking about effectively the internet in 1995, and we're talking about, you know, the genesis of this movement in 2022. So it's very difficult to really say anything definitive about the space or where it's going or what the environmental impacts are. And, you know, every single statistic that you read, it's already outdated by the time that you've quoted it. And I think it's important to remember that this is, you know, we are talking about something incredibly fluid. But of course, you know, in any Ethereum transaction and a transaction on the blockchain, you know, it uses up energy. And essentially the argument is all about how much energy are we using and how much energy is justifiable. And this is a question that we need to be asking of ourselves in all other areas of our lives as well, and not just focusing completely on cryptocurrencies. And I think that,
well, you know, this is very true. Sorry, Rhian. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a slight irony. The amount of traffic that's generated on a social media platform is using energy to sort of, you know, to send those tweets or to send those posts or whatever, just as email does. You know, there is a carbon footprint to email, to all of this kind of stuff that we do. And I think that context, or that sort of broader consideration of, you know, somehow all of these other things that we're doing don't have any environmental impact is nonsense, because clearly they do. But we're not comparing like for like, you know.
No.
How this thing gets singled out for I guess it's an easy headline, isn't it? You know, sort of.
It is. It's easy, and I think that there's also this thing with photography that, you know, we're going through a bit of a, I suppose, a series of kind of ethical questions about photography. You know, who are we commissioning and where are we commissioning them from? And if we commission a photographer that, you know, from the UK to travel to Liberia, is that the correct thing to do? No, probably we should find a Liberian local photographer to shoot that work. And that, but at the same time, while we're criticizing NFTs for carbon footprints, we're also not at the same time criticizing the publications or the process of commissioning or the kind of, you know, the geopolitical side of creating work. Or we're looking at, you know, a photographer that, for instance, has spent, I don't know, taken 25 flights to make a series of work which shows in the Gagosian. Are we subjecting them to the same level of criticism as someone that has minted some NFTs of images that they've created in their bedroom?
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
So I think it is, as you say, a very easy headline, and it's almost a little bit lazy to look at anything in such, you know, monochrome terms when we're talking about such a fluid space. So
yeah, I think, and that is the problem with social media, is that nuance disappears, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you end up with a polarized discussion almost instantly. It's very difficult to have a conversation or a discussion that explores all of those avenues, because it doesn't sit well with how social media works. You know, this kind of platform is actually much better for that, in terms of sort of finding one's way through it. Yeah, I think it's as we said at the beginning, this, you know, it's a really fast evolving space at the moment.
yeah,
Absolutely. What I was going to say, actually, just to bring up a couple of points that you guys have mentioned earlier. I mean, sustainability is such an interesting discussion when we consider the sort of establishment of you know, a very contentious term, but a term nonetheless value within the broader kind of cultural ecosystem and how we define what that means. And you know, you made a mention before, Rhiannon, about the sort of the kind of the hypocrisy or the dichotomy that is a scenario whereby we're sort of trying to kind of evaluate the carbon footprint of someone minting a selection of NFTs on the Ethereum blockchain, whilst you've got the entire infrastructure that is the art fair ecosystem and you know,
exactly.
an annual cycle that goes hand in hand with one form of value in this discussion, which is more of an economic sort of value on the kind of the trade. And you mentioned Gagosian, you know, perhaps one of the world's largest primary and secondary market commercial dealers or galleries, as it you know, with many locations. And there is a sort of an incumbence upon galleries at that level that they participate, well, I guess pre-pandemic, but yet I don't know if either of you managed to make it to Freeze or FIAC or anything like that. But we're talking about, there's almost a sense that there is a, you know, we've come back to the good old-fashioned art trade, and that's 10, 15 art fairs a year for these organizations. And one sort of worries, I mean, some of these I'm just thinking about Andreas Gursky, you know, Thomas Struth, you know, there are some huge names when we think about the discussion of kind of photography as a medium and being represented by these big organizations. And they do fly these objects, these prints, whatever these prints, you know, might be depicting around the world. And there are thousands and thousands of different objects in these locations. The carbon, I guess, sort of calculus of the logistics surrounding these phenomena, if any of you have been to art fairs, it is almost incalculable. So there's a real kind of tension going on here, which I think is fascinating. And when we look in the last sort of 18 to 24 months, the sort of the I guess the way that the discussion around NFTs and sort of the crypto discussion has entered the mainstream is something that, you know, has really kind of brought a lot of attention to this kind of transactional element of what are these digital tokens and what kinds of value do they confer when you are able to transact them in a digital, but also in sort of in a physical capacity. And I guess I was just going to ask you a question, Rhiannon. I mean, and also Nick. So there's mentioned before, there's a wonderfully slightly inherent paradox in the idea that you've got, perhaps if you're producing physical artifacts as the outcome of your creative process, then there's that sort of the scanner, let's get it online, turn it into, you know, zeros and ones. My question is sort of, to what degree is there a sort of a potential I don't know, internal discussion, and you know, amongst yourselves or within sort of the way that you want to create or want to present your work, as to you know, is there a greater viability in having more of a digital product, or is the physical product something that which is never going to be, you know, forgotten, never going to be pushed away entirely? Or can they kind of cohabit a space where they're kind of equal and slightly sort of moody bedfellows across the sort of the value divide? I don't know if you guys have any views on this.
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, what I've noticed, there's a bit of a rise with photographers offering, you know, say an NFT of their work and then saying, but you can exchange it for this. And I've done a little bit of this. And what I found most interesting is that most people who purchase NFTs have no interest in exchanging their NFT for the print. They don't want the print. They want the digital thing. They actually want that. And I think that it's possible for these two spaces to coexist. But what I was kind of getting at in the beginning with scanning Polaroids was that in order to share them, in order for them to be seen, I wanted them to become borderless in a sense. I wanted, you know, the irony of a Polaroid being hemmed in by its own border, but really desiring it to become borderless in order to share it and talk about it and share the love for it and actually save the medium. You know, oddly, the Polaroid medium would have died had it not been for people scanning in this physical thing and sharing, you know, and making it digital. That is the only reason why Polaroid as a medium exists today, is simply through scanning it, essentially.
Yeah.
And that is a great irony. But the brilliant thing that I think about, you know, crypto spaces and NFTs is that it turns everyone into a curator in a sense. You know, they can explore to their heart's content, you know, collect, curate. There are fewer gatekeepers. You don't feel that you have to travel to, you know, freeze to be able to buy work. You can buy work for the same value because you happen to have done well in the crypto space, and you can become a collector. And I think that I appreciate most the way that it just opens it up to new ways of showing this work, that maybe you have your physical exhibition and I don't know, the tickets are sold out. You can't go and visit it, but you can have a VR version of that exhibition. You can share it. It can be viewed in India where, you know, instead of having to take flights and travel to come and see this show, you can go and view it in a digital space. And you can use these kind of new digital, you know, spaces to create worlds that you just couldn't, you know, and get to introduce your work to new people that would never normally be able to see your practice. And I think that's fascinating. What I'm most interested in is when the NFT is being used as a way of creating like a new hybrid art form, not just tokenizing a thing, but also in terms of, you know, storage. For instance, an artist might be the best place to store their work. And perhaps that collector doesn't actually want to take possession of that work at this time. They just want to say, yes, I own the work, but I trust you to keep it in custody, in cold storage, or however it is.
Yeah.
And I like the idea that this gives back the artist some control over actually being able to look after their physical work, which is represented by this kind of on-chain token. And so, yeah, it will coexist.
Yeah, I agree with you, Rhian. And I think there's an interesting sort of Venn diagram to be drawn with that sort of analog and digital stuff. And I think the other Venn diagram that's also interesting is that the NFT space, as from me looking into it as a sort of as a photographer, has pulled in people from the crypto space, if you like, who maybe wouldn't have got invested or involved in making anything necessarily creative, but suddenly have kind of have seen that as an avenue. Yes, there's all sorts of stuff about, well, it's overinflated, it's hyped up, but I think you get that at the beginning of any kind of new mechanism or new process, new value mechanism, new way of exchanging something for something else, where people will try and piggyback on that and make a fast buck and all the rest of it. That will disappear. I've got no doubt about that, and things will sort of will settle down a bit more. I think the other thing from my point of view, you know, thinking about the sort of business and legal stuff that I do with AOP, is not just about art practice, but about using NFTs as a mechanism for, you know, securing licensing or passing on details of contractual arrangements between, you know, A and B, and making sure that that sort of that's recorded properly and sort of can't be altered or reneged upon in some way. Now, that may be an idealistic view, and clearly one of the issues that some people may be aware of, and I know of a few people that this gets that gets talked about, is where somebody will take somebody else's work and make an NFT of that. But in some cases, that's no different to somebody forging somebody's work, or, you know, be it through a painting or a different media. You know, and copyright infringement has been around since copyright. You know, as long as copyright's been a thing, people have been nicking other people's work and doing stuff with it that they ought not to. So I don't think that's a new challenge necessarily. It might need newer technology to deal with it and to be able to manage that. But in some ways, you know, it's just a slightly different framework on a pre-existing problem. I think, as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, that's
really interesting, Nick. Just thinking about sort of what you mentioned here, the kind of the scenario surrounding forgery. I mean, we mentioned about, I have a bit of an interest in sort of criminality in the art trade. I think it's a really fascinating discussion about sort of what constitutes the original and what is the authentic, as Rhian has mentioned earlier, which is, my gosh, how contentious can some of these discussions, well, they become very, very conceptual at the end of the day. One of the things I'm just thinking about this now, we talk about sort of scarcity, we talk about value establishment and all those kinds of things. And again, for some reason, I keep sort of pulling back to the commercial side of things, and I apologize for that. The one thing I'm very interested in discussing is that there's obviously one of the kind of the fundamentals that underpins perhaps the transaction of photography as a medium. Correct if I'm wrong here, but, you know, not only are we talking about obviously original works, but the sort of the process of editioning is so, you know, it's quite hand in glove. It's obviously very, very important. And as you mentioned earlier, Rhian, the idea that, you know, the concept of establishing that sort of trust mechanism, effectively sort of, you know, we have an example outside of maybe photography. There are certain very well-known impressionist artists, perhaps even sculptors, who, you know, when they passed away, they may not have broken the casts of the sculptures that they created. And so the family, for one reason or another, decides to recast some of these sculptures, and they find their way into the marketplace. And it's only if you know the right questions to ask about, was this cast in the hand of the artist, or was it the family member 70 years later, that you actually find out what the kind of the nomenclature might actually sort of point to. In a similar kind of way, I just wonder whether or not, talking about editioning, and I'm sure, you know, people listening in know about editioning, but maybe if either of you could sort of just mention sort of what role that plays in establishing a sense of maybe economic value in relation to scarcity, but how that might be transposed into the NFT discussion. And this is where my attention and my mind comes from, just thinking about what you mentioned earlier, Nick. The idea that I've got a digital file, and in 2022, I mint an NFT, 1 of 10, so an edition of 10 of what it is. What happens if in a year's time I decide to remint a second edition of that NFT, the exact same digital file? At what point this could also be an ethical discussion, but is it incumbent on me to shall we say, to disseminate that information to my original collectors, that there is a second edition of the NFT coming through, and it happens to be of 10 again, if you understand what I mean? Or do we think that the kind of the culture of the NFT as authentic and as original precludes that kind of the idea of me as the creative practitioner re-minting the same digital file? Is that something I'm completely down the wrong avenue on?
Well, this is a bit like I can't remember. I can't remember the guy's name, but there's a very well-known. Well, I do remember his name, but I won't mention it. But there's a well-known color photographer who I think reeditioned a series of work as inkjet prints as opposed to C-types, because that was not felt to be impinging on the value of the C-type, but actually an inkjet print at the same size was a completely different thing, and therefore had a separate value. And the collectors of the C-types, no, they wouldn't be pissed off, would they, about that sort of procedure? But yes, that, I think it's akin to that, isn't it? That as an ethical discussion, if nothing else. But actually, I think, you know, the whole point about digital and about blockchain and about, you know, this idea of having it as recorded in some mechanism, in some form, is that it's much more durable than a piece of paper that sits in somebody's drawer or gets scrunched up or lost, or the ink fades on it. I mean, the idea that and I know this is one of the criticisms that's leveled at sort of digital art in general, is, you know, the baseline question is, well, what if the URL breaks? You know, what happens if the internet goes down? You know, all of these kind of things. Well, what happens if there's a fire in the basement and your entire collection of valuable artwork turns to ash? I mean, you know, it's no different in that sense. And I think, you know, going back to these questions tend to get posed out of context of everything else that's going on, and the sort of, I think it's really important as this technology in space develops that one keeps that context of how this might relate to stuff that we already do and that we take for granted and that perhaps we don't worry about, you know, those kinds of things, because it's very easy to become completely focused or fixated on one aspect of this, about, you know, well, if the URL disappears, then I'm totally, you know, I'm stuffed, basically.
And I mean, on that point, I mean, there are so many more, you know, there are greater opportunities within the blockchain space, you know, and Web3 more generally, to be able to secure an archive than there are via any kind of centralized web mechanism that we have right now, which is just held on, you know, I mean, half of the places that we store data, you know, actually have a physical data store sitting somewhere in a desert, that should that suffer some environmental disaster or I don't know, some terrorist activity, we would lose our data. It isn't all necessarily replicated. No. Whereas this idea of, you know, the Web3 space and being able to create these much kind of broader networks where data is replicated in small strings and recomposited, it's much closer to sort of the way that we use the torrent system to download, you know, and having a kind of a seed phrase that's essentially your key to this fragmented data and giving you the lid to the jigsaw puzzle of how to put it all back together again. And in a way, that kind of idea of the reproduction sits, you know, it seems to sit at complete odds again with this idea of scarcity, because we are kind of constantly backing this data up, but also at the same time saying that, yes, but we have a token to represent its scarcity. There's a sort of something quite complicated in that relationship. But I feel far more confident as, you know, a photographer, that when I upload my files to Arweave, for instance, where I use Arweave quite regularly for my own work, which is a Web3 storage platform, I upload onto Arweave. Arweave replicates my data millions of times through a kind of peer network of storage. And I'm not then relying on Dropbox, or I'm not relying on WeTransfer, or all of these other places. Or, you know, when people say, "Oh, have you got it in the cloud?" And I mean, how many times have you had discussions with photographers about backing up their archive? Oh, well, I have one here and I have another one here, and I've got one in my studio and I've got 4 copies. Well, how about having, you know, 100,000 copies? That to me is exciting as a photographer who is worried about longevity. I find that actually, you know, I'm far less worried about those things than I am about, you know, my plans chest sitting next to a radiator and the radiator leaking. I'm far less worried about blockchain in that sense. And you're right about, you know, the idea of, I suppose, the cast and being able to reproduce this, you know, what is the original? You know, I have somewhere like a Warhol Sunday B morning print. And the only reason why that's better than just any other regular print, and it's not as good as an original Warhol, is that the original screens that Warhol's work were printed with were used to make this series of prints. So it's like a half original, you know. So where do we draw the line about what we consider to be the real thing or less real thing? Or is it something that's held by the artist at a certain time? Or is it something that we, I don't know, Damien Hirst doesn't produce most of his own work, or neither do Jake and Dinos Chapman. Does that make their work not original because they didn't physically make it? Or Andy Warhol in the factory, who was essentially telling a whole army of fabricators to make the work, does that make it less original? Or is it just something in the just general sphere of intent? And I think that that brings up very many, interesting conversations about, artistic intent, and the blockchain being able in some ways to preserve the truth of that artistic intent in a much more transparent way, where the buyer can actually see what you had intended from the outset, rather than this going through this network of garbled messaging and Chinese whispers, which is the art market at large.
I think, yeah, that's really interesting. And I think what's also interesting is, I think it's a truism to say that technology, generally speaking, evolves faster than our ability to kind of understand what it can actually do. How many of us, myself included, by the way, spend X number of hours playing games on a smartphone, when actually you've got something there that's more powerful than the first computers that sent a rocket into space or something like that. We're quite comfortable sort of working at a fairly low level with sort of the amazing technology that we have everyday access to, that we take completely for granted. And that also ties in with this persistent desire to ascribe, you were talking about limited editions, going back to the breaking the cast thing, Gareth, that you mentioned, using a very analog the whole idea of a limited edition was, the plates would physically wear out. You had to, you couldn't do more than 20. You'd have to cut a new one and actually start that process again. So 1 of 20 was actually genuinely 1 of 20 for a reason. Whereas we're talking about ones and zeros, which are infinitely reproducible, but still we want to try and put this framework of scarcity and restricting the kind of the availability of it in order to create value. So actually, I mean, again, this is a more conceptual discussion. I don't think we'll have time to cover all of this, but in terms of thinking about a completely different business model for how artists make and create work and generate income from that work, we're still working on a very old, the more scarce it is, the better, and the more exposure you have as an artist, the better. The more fame you have, the greater your things will, whatever it is you're making, will sell at. I mean, that's a very old, outdated model, isn't it? I think I remember. I'm sure you will know Jaron Lanier, and when he changed his opinion on this, which I find really interesting, because initially he was very much, I think, everything should be free on the internet, and everybody should be able to use everything else that everybody's making. And I think over a period of time, he actually came round to this notion of micropayments for things that people were doing, so that if somebody downloaded a copy of your image 100,000 times, you might have only got sort of 0.00001 of a pence for that, each of those downloads. But actually that cumulatively generated income and moved wealth around between makers and users of creative works. And I think that's, we're still not near that. I mean, we're still sort of, I think what's interesting for me with the NFT space is we're still, it feels like it's still being sort of shoehorned into a fairly traditional business model as far as that's concerned. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Gareth and Rhiannon.
I think definitely, don't you think? At the moment, we're just trying to replicate the things that we already have in this other space, rather than saying what are the potentials of this new space and how can we improve on these things. I mean, right now I'm using Brave browser for this call, and Brave browser does work in that similar way, where it rewards you for your attention. So you get paid to watch adverts rather than the adverts just being pushed at you. Yeah. Or I can then use that funding that I get from watching the adverts and tip creators that are also through the system to kind of, say, yes, I really like what you're creating. And I think that creating these sorts of economic structures and being able to, we can leave a tip, or we can throw a coin at a busker. And we do these things, but why have we never really paid much attention to doing that in a digital space? And it's all led through, big business. It's all led through the advertising revenue or massive platforms. Well, why can't it be much more kind of peer-to-peer in the way that we sustain others' practice and be able to create a more interesting creative economy that is less driven by, the one holy grail sale, and much more in a kind of a a slow burn, you know, create work and people say, oh, you know what, I really like what you write. Oh yeah, here you go, have a quid. It's a bit more of the Patreon sort of system.
Yeah. I like Patreon as a platform. Actually, I think that is something different. And I do know quite a few people who, you know, they make their living completely sort of through that sort of platform, which I think is, yeah. I mean, in some ways, it's going back to I don't know. Is that the Medici family? You know, this sort of equivalent of a bunch of patrons sort of, you know, spreading their wealth around more philanthropically. I don't know, but
well, we have real problems right now with arts funding. You know, arts funding is incredibly centralized, and you know, it's incredibly competitive, and it's very difficult to identify where to get the money from for a certain project. And all that this space is able to do is to be able to broaden the spectrum and be able to open it up to new funders who are interested in more niche subject matter, which are easier to find and browse and discover. And that can only be a good thing for the creative, you know, world itself.
I wonder if the Arts Council have had to process an application for NFT production yet.
Well, yeah, I'd be surprised if they haven't.
Yeah, I'll be interested to know what they made of it. That's for sure.
It's a really, really fascinating discussion. I mean, I love the idea of the Patreon kind of philosophy and, you know, infrastructure being applied to the art trade, and I guess in the broader creative ecosystem. I mean, one question I sort of, I guess, to play not a devil's advocate in any way, but just thinking about, you know, the discussion around this very nebulous and woolly term called quality. And sort of what that means from a creative perspective. I guess I would love to sort of know your thoughts on this, and maybe as a sort of a kind of an introduction to the idea that I'm trying to sort of think about here, is that, you know, if we go from the Medici going forward, I mean, if you study the UK's history, it's ridiculously robust in regards to sort of the art trade and that kind of relationship between the commercial side and the kind of, you know, the museological discussion and the establishment of museums and the role that dealers and galleries play in not only sort of patronizing but supporting museums and that sort of whole sort of ecosystem. I guess my question is, you know, to what degree does, for want of a better term, does the gatekeeper, as it were, the kind of the Tate Moderns, the MoMAs, Centre Pompidou's, that sort of thing. If we think about those contemporary art museums as being, and this is again exceptionally contentious, but some people perceive them to be kind of at the apogee of what we might refer to as sort of contemporary creative culture. Some have, you know, proffered the idea that actually within the NFT discussion, those hierarchical tensions are being almost sort of replaced, or at least disintermediated through the platforms in which you would mint your NFT or you would transact it. So the sort of the open seas, the super rares, etc. And I guess my question here, Nifty Gateways, etc., is, you know, are we at a point now where, I mean, have we passed the point now where this kind of idea of a hierarchy of taste or cultural quality, is that being completely toppled, or is it being reconsidered in a particular way? And actually, should those who are making decisions and those on the boards of those large international contemporary cultural spaces, should they be kind of be a little bit worried about what is actually kind of the tsunami on the horizon as far as a greater democratization of access, of support, and perhaps equity and equality within the kind of the creative landscape?
I think they should be afraid, very afraid.
I think my understanding is that some of those platforms that you mentioned, like Rarible or OpenSea, I mean, they do, a Nifty Gateway, they do operate slightly differently, don't they, in terms of whether they have any agency as far as an overview of a curatorial policy, if you like, or allowing certain people to use their platforms. Some are free for all and complete, you know, will take anybody, and others there's a higher bar to entry. But I think actually, you know, at this point in time, because everything is still very much up in the air and evolving, and going back to your point about, you know, where does perceived quality or the idea of what is good art and what is not good art, where does that fit into all of this? I think that goes back to that Venn diagram that I mentioned of people coming at this from a a tech point of view and people coming at it from an artistic point of view. And actually, I think ultimately, you know, it's a sieving process. You know, you shake it and all the sort of, you know, the rubbish drops out of the bottom and you're left with a sort of, you know, the good stuff still stays around. And I think the good stuff will be, it will be down to who's the audience, you know, who's looking at this. I mean, ultimately that, you know, if one's an artist, a maker, if you're not making work for any audience whatsoever, well, you're not going to survive, are you? Because nobody's going to be interested in it. So you're always thinking about who your audience is, who wants to see what I've got to say, who wants to listen to my voice. You know, you're always thinking about it from that perspective. If you want to, if you want to do this and make a living from it, I think that's a really, really key thing.
I think the beauty of the NFT space as well is that you mint an NFT and it's sort of forever. And I like that you, unlike the traditional way of making and selling work and establishing what quality is that, you know, we decide that something is worth something often because it's been collected by X, Y, and Z. It's been sold and shown in X, Y, and Z spaces. With the NFT, it can sit there and be viewable and be borrowed and, you know, consumed into these spaces for all time. And I like that, you know, someone like Tamara de Lempico's paintings languished in an attic for years and years and years, and then she dies and her work is discovered. If those works had been sort of publicly viewable, that might have happened a lot sooner.
Yeah.
You know, and what I like about the NFT space is, in a way, it allows us to kind of recalibrate what taste is in a much more kind of contemporary sense. And I think that there will be curators of NFTs, but I'm hoping that we don't just recreate the same gatekeeper system that we already have, which is a shame in a way that we're already seeing the kind of genesis of that in the NFT space. You know, I'm on Foundation, for instance, and Foundation is a selective platform and you have to be invited, but it's a bit of who you know. Someone will write to you and say, oh, can you invite me? Oh, yeah, sure. I've got however many invites. You sell something, you get given some more invites. You can invite more people. The idea, I suppose, initially was a bit of a quality control mechanism.
Yeah.
But does that really work? And then, you know someone who puts you on the front page, and then it just then replicates the whole system of, you know, Instagram, or, you know, kind of, I suppose, less egalitarian methods of sharing. And I hope that it doesn't go that way in a way. I hope it doesn't, because I think that the beauty of it right now is that what we exist in is a space where essentially it's going to Westfield, it's going to a mall, and you can buy anything and anything can be an NFT. And who cares that if you're buying one from the Lego shop, or you're buying something from Boots, or you're buying, you know, high-end artwork. In a sense, they're all treated the same as digital assets. Yeah. And we're sort of talking about this idea of value, but I mean, you know, the value of something when you need a product is greater, arguably greater, than when you just want a print on a wall. When you need that product, it has greater value to you than when something is just sort of a disposable thing that you feel like you want, like a collectible. And so I think that we're in this space right now where we're trying to kind of ascribe value and quality to something that we're overcomplicating it. We just need to look at it and say, this is a method of selling a thing. This is a way of proving that that thing is an authentic thing. And I did see a question that popped up earlier about minting other people's work and whether there was any way of controlling that. And right now, that's actually really difficult. You know, there are methods. OpenSea can, for instance, OpenSea is effectively at the moment custodial, for instance. So you mint an NFT, and there's often this process of lazy minting, where the NFT has not actually been created on the blockchain at the time that you mint the NFT. It's only when the NFT is bought. So while it's just kind of sitting there in the ether, it can be taken down, because what OpenSea is right now, unfortunately, is an Instagram layer. It's just a way of kind of sharing work, and then the purchaser is the person who effectively pays for the minting of the NFT, and then that happens and it's added to the blockchain. But right now, OpenSea could theoretically intervene, and I think that we will end up with, you know, greater detection systems for this. But you know, the NFT system also brings into account many kind of, you know, ethical concerns. You know, if I take a picture of a nude model, or I take a picture of an underage girl and I mint it as an NFT, how much control does that my subject have? Whereas right now you can write to a website and you can say, oh, I'm unhappy with this image and I think this is pornographic or whatever it is, and there are controls. Right now the NFT space is a free-for-all, so you can pretty much mint whatever you want. I can mint anyone else's work. But I think that's where this kind of idea of creating this artistic intent and a wallet address that becomes your showcase and becomes your signature. And I think that will become more important. And I think in a couple of years, we will start to have digitally, kind of meshed Web3 identities with our real identities, which goes in some ways against this idea of anonymity that Web3 promises. But I think that there will be these kind of trust spaces within the landscape where, individual artists who are wanting to create this legacy work or, a wallet address that really represents their practice. I think that, right now we're at the early stages, but I think that will become much more integrated. And then you will be able to say, this is, the real address of the estate of Andy Warhol, and this is not in the way that, I could take I've got a Martin Parr print just above me. I could take that, scan that in, and I could go and sell it. Technically, I could do that. No one is actually going to stop me from doing that right now. But is it real? No. And so we're, again, coming back to this idea of, the NFT space, we are comparing things that we already do in real life and that already happen. It just seems that it's an easier way of doing it with this new world. But I think that these issues will be ironed out.
Yeah, and there's another thing that's working there as well, which you mentioned, Rhiannon, which is, this idea of accountability and being an identifiable person. And that's a very separate discussion and has been, around on social media and about how you verify who somebody actually is and giving somebody, if somebody says something or somebody publishes something, that they're held accountable for what they've said and what they've published, so that you don't hide behind a pseudonym, you don't hide behind a random series of letters and numbers or whatever. And I think that will feed into what we're talking about as well, in terms of how, in terms of creating, I suppose, some idea of provenance and value, and pegging the work to somebody who is making bodies of work like you do, Rhiannon, about a topic, or about several bodies of work about one topic, where you go back and re-explore things. People want to be connected to that person, and to have the feeling of a conduit between the maker and the viewer.
I mean, in essence, I know that the idea of Web3, in a sense, is that we can be anonymous and we can transact via a wallet that isn't attached to a name. But when you're a creator, your value is ascribed to who you are. Essentially, it's what work you've produced and your name.
Yeah.
So those things will never really translate. It will never be that there are truly anonymous NFT projects, because in order to create a sense of value and legacy and a kind of trajectory for your work, you're always trying to prove that you are the person that created that work, and you talk about the work and you become identifiable. So I kind of feel that the NFT space, when we're kind of arguing these points out, I think that people are forgetting that essentially an artist is only as good as their reputation is.
Yeah, that goes back to what we said right at the beginning about we're still working on a very well-established sort of traditional model in which we're trying to sort of squeeze all of this this tech and this new vocabulary into, which I think is interesting. Rather than completely trying to. And this is more difficult. I totally get this, to step outside of the established model and to go, right, how else could we get this to work? What other way could we generate? How could we generate revenue from what we all make as creators?
Yeah, and I think I'm just really excited by the new organizational structures and the spirit of collaboration, and the fact that it is new and that we can solve a lot of these problems. We can actually look at them and develop solutions to this really fast, instead of it being a network of, for instance, coders that were fantastic at being coders and very talented, but never really knew necessarily what to do with some of that talent. And what's nice about this is we're actually getting two different brains meeting in this particular space and being able to explore the potential of each area of their expertise and say, oh, you know what, this is a problem that I experience in my day-to-day life. You know, I used to be an agent, and when I was working as an agent, sometimes there'd be an advertising agency say, oh, so we've got this model, we really want to reuse this picture. Oh, we call it the modeling agency. Oh no, then we don't rep them anymore. We haven't heard from them for ages. We don't know how to track them down. And I'd be sitting there on Google trying to find this model to say, we owe you some money. You know, I love the fact that with, you know, the NFT, what you were saying in the beginning, that there's this potential that we can kind of encode someone's wallet address and be able to pay them, you know, long after perhaps we've lost the contact details, that we're just represented by this kind of financial string. And I think that that's quite liberating in a business sense. And, you know, I say that to a coder and they go, oh, you know what, that's actually, God, I didn't know that that's how things worked in photography. I had no idea. It's because people are not having those conversations.
It's
and now
left brain meets right brain.
Yeah, now all of a sudden we're having these conversations about how to distribute things, how to establish ownership, how to establish rights. You know, what are your rights? What is real? What is not real? And I think that's a really important space to kind of find ourselves in 2022, 2021, you know, where we're talking about these things.
Yeah.
And being able to come up with actual real world viable solutions. So
I noticed Antigone's reminded us that you want to show some of your work.
Show some work, yeah. Well as might. So sorry to cut you off and just ruin it all with showing work, but there we go. Let me do this, press share. Yes, and I'm going to go to here. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So you know my name by now, so there's rather no point in me having this slide. But this is the sort of work that I'm talking about. So this is a Polaroid emulsion lift, and each one of these little parcels of information are individual parts of Polaroids. And so this has built up a fictional landscape. And this was created over, you know, several months, and it's in Benidorm and Margate, and it was talking about just generally the idea of what the British seaside is. And I interviewed a lot of people in Margate who spoke to me about their memories of the place, and so I found things that resembled parts of their memories and then strung them together into this fictional landscape. And I started making this work because a gallerist early on said to me, well, the only trouble with Polaroids is that they're so small and people don't want to buy small work. So I started making larger work. And of course, this is a one of one. So no one else can own this apart from the original owner. And so this is the area that I find interesting for NFTs, is being able to, for instance, show this and be able to, I don't know, mint a copy of the video of how this is made, and I don't know, sell a workshop alongside it and say, I'll teach you how to make your own, or whatever that might be. But so I find that particularly interesting. So this was the book that I wrote about Polaroid creative techniques and its other foreign editions. So this is now being reprinted, so there'll be a new one out, I think it's March. And it covers pretty much everything that you could think of doing with Polaroid film. And I also make kind of monographs and experimental publications. So this is one that I made, again, about Margate and Benidorm, Wastelands, Dreamlands, or Dreamlands, Wastelands, depending on how you want to say it. One side was Margate and one side was Benidorm. And few people know that T.S. Eliot completed his poem, The Wasteland, in Margate. And the name of the fairground in Margate is Dreamland. So that's what this came from. And one story was one way up and one story was the other way up, the kind of parallels between Margate and Benidorm, and this idea of the British seaside and the rise of air travel and the demise of the Victorian seaside. So that's what this is. And then I also do kind of very long form, much more standard documentary photography. So this was an installation that I had at the Photographer's Gallery. And this I actually made into kind of a Matterport 3D experience. So I have a VR version of this, which is another thing that I might at some point make into an NFT, where you can listen to the audio, or you can hear me talking about like reading the captions aloud for the images or something similar. So I'm really interested in that bridge of being able to make the NFTs into something conceptual, to add this other layer of archive to the work. And this project was about Pitcairn Island, which is a 2 by 1 mile lump of rock in the Pacific Ocean that is Britain's last remaining overseas territory. And it's home to fewer than 50 people. So at last count, it was 41. And it became very famous in 2004 for a string of high-profile child sexual abuse trials that divided the community. And my project really deals with kind of aftermath and the fallout of that. And it's told through a selection of, Polaroids, medium format images, audio, objects, very long captions. And this is what has been published by Blow Up. So we're about to launch this. So it's been printed, and I'm just waiting for COVID to slightly die down so people might actually fancy going for a drink again before I do a proper launch. But this is the book. And I'm very interested again in this idea of the object. And so it does seem somewhat ironic that I should be in the NFT world at all, because I'm very much obsessed with the idea of the object. But when I was creating this, one of the things that I found difficult was editing this down, and also not being able to include so much of the kind of background material, like the audio or the film, or all of the extra material that I created that give a more three-dimensional sense of the work. And so we're actually in the process of creating an AR layer for this, so to be able to use your phone to scan the pictures in the book and then unlock an AR layer of content where you can listen to the people speaking and hear what they sound like, or be directed to a news article, or where I've used an excerpt of something to go to the full document. So I'm kind of building that out at the moment. And then this is a project I made with my very good friend Laura Panak that some of you might know. We made this work about Peckham, and this is actually an image that has been, the negative itself has been damaged by saliva. And what we did was take inspiration from the Peckham experiment, which was a holistic health experiment in Peckham. And it was the idea of, are you affected internally by your sort of family environment, or is it to do with, kind of external factors? Is it to do with your health? How do all of these elements come together to create this idea of health? So we gathered samples, as they would have done when they were running these tests, and applied them to the film to ask the question of whether you could create a picture of health. And so we used urine from our subjects, and each person was photographed with one roll of film. So we take 12 images and then combine the film before it was processed with a sample taken on the day. And we'd leave it stewing, and according to the potency of whatever we'd added to the film, it would determine how destroyed the picture came out. So if someone had not drunk a lot of water, their urine would be incredibly alkali. So it would end up being that the film would be really, really destroyed. And so when you processed it, you could really physically see that person was dehydrated. So it was really, so this is a very dehydrated urine sample that's destroyed the film. And this is how it ends up turning out like. This is a kid also that had eaten a hell of a lot of sweets and consumed a lot of E numbers. And so this idea of this internal and external, I'm very interested in. And then this was a similar sort of project. And I'm showing some of this, if any of you happen to be in Bristol at any point in the next few months, there's some of this work at the Martin Parr Foundation opening next week. This was a project I made with BJP about fracking, and which is hydraulic fracturing, breaking apart the bedrock to release natural gas. And they pump a lot of chemical into the rock under very high pressure, and it creates these fissures, and it has to come out somewhere. So it generally enters the water supply at some point. Some of it gets pumped out and some of it escapes. So this again was looking at the differences between what clean water would look like. So on the left-hand side, I had 2 Hasselblad cameras, and I shot one of them with film that I processed as normal in clean water, and the one on the right was processed using water from Carbridge Brook, which was where the fracking site runoff ended up. And this is the same process here. And then, so this is a little bit about my NFTs. So these are kind of well-known pictures from my archive that I had sold out of. So these are ones that there is no more an edition, physical edition. So I made an NFT version of it so that you can own like a one of one on the blockchain. And then I thought, what was fascinating really about the Polaroid was the process of development. The process of development is the thing that everyone falls in love with a Polaroid. It's the kind of moment of magic. It's the shared experience of watching this image emerge from the gloom. And of course, once the picture is finished and complete, that process is lost. So, we rarely actually preserve the idea of the processing, which is, of course, the kind of magical ingredient which affects everything about how that image turns out. So I started making these. I don't know if this can show, where this actually is just a film of the development process as the picture becomes what the picture becomes. And obviously I film this in real time. So I film the development process, and it's basically a stop motion with many thousands of images all strung together to kind of create this final work. And I like this element where you can create an NFT of something that is actually invisible once you've physically made the Polaroid. That process is lost. So the NFT is really the only evidence of that process existing. And then, because of all this environmental criticism, I thought I'd put my money where my mouth is. And I'm using Rarible to mint on Tezos blockchain to put this series that I've been working on for a while about the Salton Sea in California, which is a kind of a site of environmental disaster, to be honest. And people that live there really are living on the front lines of climate change. And very little money is spent on, I suppose, rehabilitating this area that's become an essential part of the kind of the wildlife ecosystem of California. Many birds live there and migrate there and use it as their stopping off point, but the sea is becoming more and more saline as the years go by. And the California government has had, as you probably know, a real big problem with droughts. And so they just don't have the water to be able to keep topping up the sea. And it's in the middle of the desert, so it just evaporates and evaporates and evaporates. And within it, all of the agricultural runoff that comes from all of the nearby farms becomes more highly concentrated. So the banks are covered in this kind of fine silt that when the desert winds pick up, it takes to the air, and air quality in this area for 85% of the year was below the recommended kind of healthy level. And so this NFT is being sold in order to benefit the Salton Sea Action Committee, who are helping to rehabilitate the Salton Sea. And then more recently, I've been working on endowment. So N is from the Latin, which means to be a part of. DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization. And Mint, as Nick suggested in the beginning, is a word that we hear a lot now talking about the blockchain. And so what I'm doing is trying to onboard photographers and artists that want to create like NFT work that is kind of blockchain native work by kind of capitalizing on the well-known people within the space to create kind of more healthy and collaborative environment. So to basically use the model of panini stickers where you buy blind, but you know that there are different panini stickers that are included in the run and have different rarity ratings. And so you buy it for a small amount and you think, oh, I'll buy this because there's a chance that I might get something very, very rare. And then the idea of this is that everyone gets paid equally and everyone gets paid well because there are enough of these packs of NFTs to be sold that will generate enough revenue to kind of keep everyone happy. But it also introduces new artists to the space. And then from that, with the DAO, the idea would be to kind of allow like a sort of like a curation layer from within the artist community to invite other artists to actively participate and to give grants to create new work, rather than using this kind of haggard system that we have right now where, you know, it's often the people who are the most well-connected that manage to be funded. So this idea would be to kind of have artists be the authors of the funding mechanism and be able to actively encourage a more healthy ecosystem, which in the long term benefits everyone. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. And then if you feel like getting in touch with me or asking any questions, I'm usually pretty good with answering questions. So these are my contact details should you feel so inclined. I'm on Twitter on a rather obscure name, but that was the name of a camera I had sitting on a desk at some point. And I just thought this Twitter thing will never take off. And yeah. So
this is fantastic, and thank you so much. I was really echoing the comment on the YouTube channel where a student was just asking to see some of your work. So I thought it was high time we did that. That's great. Thank you.
Maybe the one day.
Brilliant. Are there any other questions from the audience? I was just trying to look at the YouTube channel, but I haven't seen more.
Just following up, Rhiannon, on what you've just shown, the idea that you can, I mean, for me, that the work that you've done with Polaroids and then making that the recording of something that is so transitory and just disappears into something that's then a digital artifact, if you like. I think that for me, that synergy is it's a perfect fit for that. That's got a really nice. Yeah, just it feels so natural as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, the idea of being able to create something that's a one-off, I think that's really exciting, like a one-off of the process. And you know, there's always this discussion with NFTs that anyone can watch it, so who owns it? And I mean, you can argue the same thing for anyone can walk into a gallery space and go and look at work on the wall or take a picture of the Mona Lisa, but you don't own the Mona Lisa. So I'm happy for more people to see the work and for it to be visible in a wallet. And for other people to kind of share in that idea of, you know, watching this thing develop. You know, that shared experience is what drew me to Polaroid, which is ironically the thing that is lost through all the scanning. And so being able to bring that back has been really nice. And I mean, you know, I could have done that, for instance, in a gallery space. I could have made a whole show just of loops of the development process. I could have done that. But then you have that problem that video artists have where they say, well, how do I sell this work? You know, what is the object that I sell? Yeah. And then my friends who work in that space are often saying, oh, I'm going to get a really nice portfolio box made and I'm going to make a jeweled USB key so that the person buying it is actually buying a physical thing. And what they're getting is a USB key that perhaps will be outdated technology in a few years' time and won't be able to transform. And so we're often kind of shoehorning an art form that doesn't really fit into trying to make it a physical object. And I think that same thing about the ephemeral experience of watching, you know, how do you shoehorn that into a physical object or, you know, show it on a screen in a way that feels authentic? And I don't see it's any different from being able to watch it on a screen as an NFT versus putting it on a screen in a gallery space. So yeah, I'm definitely interested in the ways that NFTs are allowing us to kind of explore different elements of our work, or being able to think about all of the kind of experiential aspects, or all of the you know, I don't know, maybe you just make an NFT of a conversation. You know, we could make this into an NFT and then it will last forever rather than leaving it on YouTube where it might be taken down. You know, I like that idea.
Yeah.
So.
Definitely.
Well, maybe on this great note, we can bring this fantastic discussion to an end. Thank you all very much for joining. That's absolutely fascinating. And as you said, we have to wait and see, you know, I think there are many thanks from for the people who watch on the YouTube channel. For those, all of you out there, just a reminder that tomorrow, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday this week, we will be at the Lightwell in the AVA building, and we'll be Friday back here on the YouTube channel. So please come in tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday. And thank you to Nick, Rhiannon, and Gareth again. Thank you very much.
No, thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah, you too, albeit virtually. The new way of experiencing life.
Yeah.
Very meta, the whole conversation.
Totally.
So.
Thanks, everybody, and see you all soon.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.